you begin by just telling us a little bit about who you are?
So, yeah, my name is Donele Wilkins, and I am the founder and happen to be the CEO of the Green Door Initiative, lifelong Detroiter resident, and lifelong sort of advocate around environmental justice. Been doing that work for well over 25 years or so. Committed to ensuring that everyone lives a life that honors the environment, that honors who they are as human beings, and have access to clean air, safe drinking water, and safe places to roam, educate, and worship, and all those things. That's who I am.
Thank you. We're going to be talking a little bit about water security today. Can you tell me a little bit about what that means to you?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that water is vital for every creature and human being, and without it, we're not able to survive. It is an absolute necessity for life. And that being said, when someone does not have access to something that requires them to take part in so that they can live and have a good quality of life, that represents insecurity, and that represents a dishonor for life.
In the Detroit context, what are some of the major issues that are around water that you focused on?
Well, I'm especially focused on having access to clean, healthy, drinkable water, usable water, number one, and also very much interested in ensuring that residents in Detroit also have the privilege and the pleasure of accessing water for recreation and all the things that just requires and helps us be whole human beings. And so I celebrate and support that and work towards that in my work life and everyday life. Water in Detroit is huge. It has been a major conversation piece. It's been a struggle particularly for the underserved population, those that are struggling economically to afford water. And in my opinion, I don't think that really should be an issue, a struggle. I think as a society, as a community, we need to work to figure out ways that people can have the very basic things to live out a decent life.
So, you know, I want to take advantage of your long history of working on this area, and maybe I wonder if, over the next few minutes we could sort of go over how this entire situation unfolded, because our problems related to water didn't just materialize just like that. Could you maybe, in your own words, starting from the beginning, or from wherever that you think is best to start, try to contextualize and put all of this in context for us?
Sure. I think the water crisis in Detroit really begins with an inhumane approach to public policy and access to resources. I think there is a huge gap between those who make decisions, whether elected or appointed, and those that have to live with the decisions that folks who are in decision-making roles make. I want to start there because I think that's the context. I think that the way that our municipality has been set up around water and the decision makers at the Water Commission Board and now the Great Lakes Authority. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I believe that there was a mixture of corruption that was pretty much, I guess, promoted by greed. So the way that the system was set up is separate from sort of the way that decisions typically are made at the city, where the city council has a lot of authority, the mayor has the authority, and those decisions take place. Well, with the way that the decision-making process and policies around water have been set up in the city of Detroit, it removes accountability, if you will, particularly for people who've been elected by the voter and the residents in the city. When they're not engaged in the decision-making process, there's a failure to be accountable. And that being said, I just believe that it got out of control and oversight just became a minimal process in the city of Detroit, and ultimately we are where we are today. We have seen some folks who have been given the authority and responsibility around decision making pay for it through the legal process, and that's helpful and hopeful. But the reality is, we're so far away from what's supposed to be, I don't know, an appreciable norm for folks in our community around access and affordability where water is concerned, that finding our way to what's considered humane has been a difficult process. Then I need to also put in place this conversation around the battle over who controls Detroit water and sewage. When you have more than 88 communities or beyond that exist and connect to the Detroit water and sewage, there's always been sort of this division around authority and power when it comes to decision making. Detroit versus everyone else, Detroit versus the other communities, not even county wise, just Detroit versus everyone. And there's always been a threat that Detroiters have acknowledged and recognized and always wanted to maintain sort of their role in overseeing and providing the primary oversight when it comes to water usage. Now that that is not the case, given that we now have the Great Lakes Water Authority, I think that that diminishes even more the ability for Detroiters to benefit, if you will, from a humane and righteous approach to access to quality water. It's just a combination and real convoluted kind of process. And I really want to give credit to the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, We the People, and other organizations who stepped up in this space of leadership to ensure that the most vulnerable of our community has access to something like has access to water. I mean, the basics to thrive in. And if not for them, we wouldn't even be this far in terms of ensuring that the city and others have set aside certain resources that would be made available, though that's not enough, but it would be made available to the most vulnerable. And I think that's key in terms of how to make certain that decision makers really listen and adhere to. Regular citizens have to step up. They have to make certain that their voices are heard. They have to understand that they do have power, and they really need to work to make that happen.
You know, what you said echoes a lot of the historical record, because in so many ways, Detroit is unique, and the water sewage department is almost like a crown jewel.
Yes.
Not a lot of cities have, municipal governments have. And Dana Kornberg's work, for instance, goes over the long history of, you know, this tussle between, like you said, Detroit versus everyone, the suburbs on the outside and Detroit for decades.
Yes.
Partly fueled by, you know, racism. Let's be
Let's make that clear. Yeah,
frank.
yeah. That was an assumption, but I should have been clear about that.
So from and then leading to and you also mentioned corruption, and so a lot of some of the people we've interviewed, for instance, also talked about how you know, being behind on water bills was not necessarily new for a lot of people, but in the past, it was almost okay to be behind on your water bills. The DWSD didn't necessarily come after you, and that changed.
Yes.
And could you talk a little bit about this change, both in terms of thinking about the centrality of water and water bills, and the way that DWSD has also changed, perhaps, because I can see arguments on both sides,
Yeah.
for corruption and for greater accountability. But again, your insight would probably be very helpful.
I agree. I mean, water is not it's not fair to consider water to be free. There's an infrastructure that has to be maintained, although many may argue that that hasn't been a consistent approach. But even as we clean the water and make it suitable for consumption and use, that costs. So yes, everyone should have a way to pay for that resource, getting into their homes and taking full advantage of that. No argument there. When you have had a long-standing, maybe not written policy, but a long-standing policy, you set a precedent for, and to like just cut that off without any warning, without any time for transitioning in a way that would allow folk to get a handle on it without being robbed of the benefit of use. So I think there's an issue of policy leadership and how one handles that kind of concern. Yes, the city needs the resources, absolutely. But how do you do that in a humane, responsible way so that we can ensure that everyone has access to something that we're as human beings depend on in terms of our life and quality of life. I mean, so I have no qualms with anyone that says, well, it's not free, water isn't free. I do have problems with how you sort of ravel the precedent set by decades of policies that allow for this, and then, cold turkey say, that's it, you're done, without consideration for what that may mean to a household or an individual.
Can you talk us through, because from my knowledge, most of the watershed has really started in earnest around 2005 or so, maybe a little later. Could you talk us through your recollection of this entire process, bankruptcy, emergency management, and then
right? So this idea that Detroit voters and residents no longer had the privilege of making decisions regarding who gets to manage or oversee the city and decision-making processes is a real threat to humanity, particularly when it comes to this access to water. So when this process of emergency managers popped up and designated Black communities across the state, not just places where there may have appeared to be some struggle with managing city systems and resources, because there are predominantly white communities that also had the same kind of issues. But the decisions...
Can we stop for a second?
Okay. So you were telling us about emergency management and the idea that Black communities cannot be trusted to take care of themselves.
Yes. So that was to a lie from the pit of hell, basically, but it was a way strategically to take over resources in municipalities and to even propagate this discourse that created even more distrust and gaps between the suburbs and the city, especially as the suburbs were receiving rate hikes, and blaming the city for Detroiters for those rate hikes, and it was justifiable in their minds to be able to take over, if you will, the decisions around water use in the city and in the region. So, I mean, it worked for them. The problem with all of this is that we found our cities going deeper into debt. City of Detroit was no different with this proposed leadership, better form of emergency intervention around leadership at the municipality level. So it didn't work out to benefit the city. It just set up sort of this falseness that it was time for a change, and even when emergency management was no longer in existence at the city of Detroit, it was time to actually relieve Black folks of that responsibility. And now we have leadership that looks very different from the majority population in the city. So the racism has systemic racism has deep roots in places like Detroit, and the city. This is the result of that systemic racism.
How did you first find out about, the water shutoffs occurring at, the scale that it was? Can you think
I
back
could
and
give
reflect on
credit
that?
to people like Miriam Kramer and what's her name? Her partner in crime, if you will. Oh, I can't think of her name at the moment. It'll come back. No, not Monica. No. No. Way before them. Miriam
Charity?
Kramer, not even Charity. It was Miriam Kramer and, oh, I can't believe I can't think of this woman's name. It'll come back to me in a minute. No, they were the first. They headed up the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization. They had Maureen Taylor. I can't, forgive me, Maureen, if you ever see this piece. Maureen Taylor, right? The voice and the conscience for the poor and underserved in the city began to really speak out loud about these issues. And the fact that there was this crisis when it comes to access to water and affordability. So others followed, and they've done great work. They picked up the baton, and I know all of them, Lila, and I knew Charity and everyone, and it's a pleasure to know, the We the People leadership and that kind of stuff, and the work that they've taken on as a result of this. But it's been a long time coming. It's because of the righteous fight for folks who couldn't necessarily fight for themselves or have access to decision makers in the way that Marion and Maureen, Marion and Maureen have had as a result of their long standing in the community when it comes to justice and advocacy. So that's how I first heard about it. I remember attending a meeting at I think it's Central United Methodist Church downtown under the leadership of Pastor Ed Rowe, where that's where the Michigan Welfare Rights folks were housed and would hold certain meetings and inform people of what was going on. And because I've been doing environmental justice work since the early 90s, it was a natural for me to be aligned with some of the things that they were doing, to see what kind of technical ability particularly when it comes to quality of water and that kind of thing. That would aid in the conversations that would ultimately lend itself to coming up with some remedies, demanding remedies for people who are struggling. So, yeah, that was early on. I would say uh, predating 2005. I mean, Miriam and Maureen have been around a long time, and they really created the foundation that others are able to stand on.
Well, you know, I think 2014, 2013 was when it sort of went well beyond 15,000 households, and then since then, you know, numbers have just climbed. Of course, now we're down to 5,000 is the expected 5,600, but there's still thousands. Were you shocked? Were you surprised? Were you? What was your? Can you think of how did you react?
During the 2013,
Yeah,
when
when
things
you
really
learned about
escalated. Yeah, so um, I I really hate to say this, but I can't say that I was shocked. I have been doing environmental justice work for many years, and you know, was to be expected, like, unfortunately. And so, but the unwillingness on the part of the city and decision makers to consider these huge impacts in the city, that may have been even more of a disappointment and a shock to me. Like, we're all human beings. There are children, these are babies, there are the elderly, there's the disabled, there's poverty, there's all these issues. Like, where are we as a city when it comes to our most vulnerable? What are our opportunities to meet the needs of those folks? Then when you add this idea of a shrinking city, and that was the conversation taking place during that time as well. Oh, you know, this was a city at one point in its height in the 50s at nearly 2 million people. When this crisis hit, you know, we're now down to 900,000. Today, we're, you know, under 600,000, if not less than that. And the way that sometimes my mind works, I call it healthy paranoia. I'm like, man, that worked to get people to leave the city. What a nice way to cleanly say, well, we're just going to restrict and withhold natural resources and resources in a way that makes you that would allow you to live in a decent way. Let's withhold those. Let's shut down some of those pipes and access in certain parts of the city. And let's see if we can get some people who we wouldn't mind leaving the city leave. So we can start afresh and look like we've saved. You know, we come in as saviors, and we're ready now to make Detroit a world-class place. And that means that those that have been traditionally indigenous to this community would not enjoy those benefits that will come along at some point in the city. So shocked? No. Disappointed? Yes. And I almost believe that remedies will begin to come forward because they won't have to deal with the folks who they've had to deal with, the undesirable people they would like not to be in the city of Detroit if they could help it.
You know, you called it paranoia, but there were plans to actually gradually move populations out of particular neighborhoods. There are plans.
Yeah.
I mean, they're getting a lot of pushback, and rightly so. But neighborhoods like Delray, for instance, not necessarily connected with water issues,
Right.
there are neighborhood plans to reshape neighborhoods to to have that lower footprint.
Yeah.
Another theory that I've heard, not sure if it's a conspiracy theory or not, but it connects really what's happening in Detroit with what's also happening in Flint. And the argument that I've been hearing is that part of the goal for removing Flint from the Detroit water supply
was to disconnect. Yeah.
Was to really make DWSD really financially
vulnerable,
unstable to move it towards emergency management. I mean, so you've heard that.
And I believe that.
Okay.
No, I'm not. I certainly do. It was a good way. Let's starve Detroit. Flint was a good, Flint took care of their bills, their water bills. They were a large customer. And, I believe there was a quote during the investigation process, who's responsible for what happened in Flint. And there's a quote from an official who basically, as they were considering the disconnect and learning about, as a result of that disconnect, the impacts of that disconnect, the statement was made, well, who would care about the risk and the fallout that occurs in Flint? Like who no one will care about that. So the collateral damage around it, as far as they were concerned, wasn't worth saving the 12,000 children and others who were impacted and disconnected from the city of Detroit's the Detroit River resource. That being said, one of my biggest sort of concerns around all of this has been, why wasn't the Flint River and the resources near Flint usable? And no one's talking about industry's role in making a resource like the Flint River unusable. No one's talking about General Motors and the family under the umbrella of General Motors and its contribution. Now we're talking about it in terms of its connection to PFAS and that kind of thing. But no one has really raised. The only time we heard about the industry's sort of role in this is when they noticed that the materials they needed to build their automobiles and their vehicles were rusting, and that there was a real probability that was a result of the disconnection process. And they were able to win some kind of waiver with the state, with the governor, so that they can reconnect in a way that would protect their resources. Now that happened, but there was nothing done to ensure at that time that the residents and the populations depending on that water source would also be protected. So that's something that I really want to raise in this conversation, and I think given the work that I've done around environmental justice and the accountability that industry has, corporations have, to the quality of life when it comes to natural resources and access to the ability to drink healthy, safe, clean water. We have to talk about that. So.
To a lot of people outside, I think, Michigan, or even maybe outside certain circles in Detroit, this seems like conspiracy talk. But you believe it, and I believe that you have strong reason to believe this. Why do you believe it?
Well, I want to talk again. I go back to policy, public policy. In Detroit alone, there are 400 corporations that have the legal authority to discharge into the Detroit River. The Environmental Protection Agency, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water, and that the decisions, the delegated responsibilities at the state level allows that. They're industrial waste. Now, I didn't say hazardous waste, But when there is not enough enforcement and folks coming out checking on systems and what have you, who's to say that even hazardous materials are not also released into these systems? We know that today because we're experiencing PFAS, we experience Flint, and around this country, I mean the state and this country. So yeah, there is some real substantial reasons and basis for my concerns and statement about culpability. So until the Environmental Protection Agency, I appreciate the new leadership of our current governor and really hope that she continues on this process of just checking in on DEQ, or the new name, EGO, I'm sorry, that we can begin to protect these natural resources, which in the very sort of initial stages of protecting natural resources, you're protecting public health. Mm-hmm. In order to do that, you have to hold folks accountable, and you have to do that by ensuring enforcement of laws that are already on the books, not new ones, laws that are already on the books, and placing the resources in the right places so that there's proper enforcement and insurance that those resources are protected, so that we're not struggling also with the fact that we could be consuming some bad water. And for those of us who may think that this would happen in Flint we can avoid, I think that's a false sense of security. And I really do think, given the current conversations around water quality and whatever, I think we need to be much more diligent in ensuring that the quality of water is where it should be.
Thank you. I appreciate that, because a lot of people talk about lack of trust, but we don't necessarily try to explain why is there a lack of trust. How does it, spring from these lived experiences?
Yes.
So I appreciate you explaining that.
You're welcome.
Tell me a little bit about your long history of work. More than one person has told me Donele is the mother of the environmental justice movement in Detroit.
Don't say that. That makes me feel really old. No. I'm a child of the movement.
The older sister.
Exactly.
Tell me a little bit about your work and how it's evolved over the past few years.
Well, the work, it wasn't necessarily something I set out to do. It found me. I like to say I was a born advocate. And there's just something really basic when it comes to just having our needs met as human beings that I find deplorable when we're not able to do that because of public policy and racism and this idea that some people are more valuable than others. So it found me because my background, when it found me, I was doing work around worker health and safety, and I had a special interest when it comes to black workers because they're typically working in the least paying kind of jobs, most dangerous jobs, and rarely get to enjoy retirement. When they retired, they were struck with all kinds of sicknesses and illnesses and chronic disease, and maybe didn't live too long after retirement. So that was a motivator for me. In doing the work that I was doing back in the late 80s, someone kind of learned about what I was doing. I was a real youngster then, and like young people taking on something bigger than themselves, it was how I decided I wanted to live my life. And someone kind of touched me out of the University of Michigan, to be honest, and I would be remiss if I do not mention Dr. Bunyan Bryant, mentor and my hero, the real godfather for environmental justice in the nation, unsung hero in a lot of ways. But anyway, he led this effort to pull together a national conference summit, if you will, on environmental justice that um, uh, was composed of people of color, underserved, and poor people across this country. And they called it the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And he asked if I would participate in that conference in Washington, D.C. And I did, and it changed my life. And while the work around workplace health and safety was critical and important, I justified sort of taking on the EJ movement and leaving that a little bit behind by the fact that the labor movement was there for the workforce. And if I could get people of color and black folks especially to get more involved in health and safety committees and that kind of stuff, that infrastructure would help to take care of that. In the meantime, the same people that I was fighting for with regard and advocating for in the workplace really are the same people who are the underdogs when it comes to environmental protection. And at the time I got involved, it was very interesting working for an entity that was focused on workplace and workers and unions. The conversation at that time was building the incinerator. And so I had something right in my face that created, a real, opportunity for really looking at my life and my role and what I would be doing going forward. That moment passed me by because I had very little information about environmental issues. My eyes were woke when I attended the 1991 conference that the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice led and spearheaded with folks like Dr. Bunyan Bryant. I get there and it's too late by the time we return to get involved necessarily in the incinerator, and until recently, we've been fighting that fight for decades to shut it down, to make it more accountable and all that that comes with that. I did realize that I needed to spend my life advocating for for folks like myself. And here's the real interesting deal. For every plant and every factory that I was fighting with workers to improve, they were conspicuously located in communities that look like me, in neighborhoods that look like me. And the light bulb went on and was like, hey, wait a minute. Now, who's speaking for the people who breathe what comes out of the smokestacks, who fish and eat fish that's filled with contaminants and toxins because of dirty water? Who's speaking for the asthmatic child and the lead poisoned child and the elderly and disabled folks? Who's doing that? And there was a real sort of gap in terms of leadership, particularly from the ground up. And so my purpose was to help lead an effort that would make environmental justice a household phrase, confront decision makers at every level. And I did at and not alone, but at the local level, city council, mayors, the state level, governors and decision leaders, at the national and federal level, at the White House, and wherever we needed to bring a voice from the disadvantaged and what have you. That was my job, and I was pleased to do that. I started along with a couple people in my living room, Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice, and was the founding director of that organization, led it for 15 years, and the job that we set out to do was done. We set out to make it a household phrase, and now everybody's talking about environmental justice in our city at every level in the state. Everyone talks about environmental justice. The irony in our early days of doing this work was that we took on a fight that emanated out of Flint. Happened to be the birthplace and home of Dr. Bunyan Bryant. There was an issue where another factory, or I'm sorry, incinerator was being built to manage lead construction debris, leaded construction debris. And Flint basically began to recognize that that could be a problem if that facility was built. And the largest customer that they would have would be Detroit. So it was how I cut my teeth on my first advocacy effort, working with the Flint chapter of the NAACP and whatever back then. So I found it really interesting that decades later, here we are still talking about lead. Flint's still challenged with it, and from a different front. So yeah, that's how I got started, and I'm happy to see all the new leadership and folks that have really taken the baton and really have taken this work to even a greater level. But yeah.